Tonight's lecturer is Dr. Ted Widmer. Ted is a graduate of Harvard University at the bachelor's, master's, and PhD levels. His PhD was in the history of American civilization. He is distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York. In addition to his teaching, he writes actively about American history in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and other venues. He's also taught or directed research centers at Harvard, Brown University, and Washington College. He grew up in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and he is here with us tonight to talk about Lincoln on the Verge. I'll now turn the program over to Ted, and then I'll rejoin after his presentation to moderate questions as time permits. So don't forget, enter your questions on the chat feature and we'll get to them. Thank you so much again for joining us. Ted?
Dick, thank you so much for those kind words. So nice to be with the Filson. I wrote a little bit about the Filson today on Twitter. I'm an extremely new convert to Twitter. Managed to make it a long way without ever being on any social media. And I wanted to promote tonight's talk. And I just said local historical societies are jewels. And the Filson sets a very high standard for all of them around the country. And for me in my research with this project, local history was absolutely key. I wanted to study how Lincoln looked as he went through hundreds of communities on a long train trip from Springfield, Illinois to Washington in February 1861. So I really depended on the records that were kept meticulously by local history societies throughout that winding train trip. So what the Filson stands for is really important, not just to Louisville and to Kentucky, but to the whole country for showing everyone how it should be done. And your series of free programs during the COVID time is really inspiring, and I'd love to hear the McDonald's talk. That sounds absolutely fascinating. My topic tonight is considerably more old-fashioned than that. It's a deep study of Abraham Lincoln in a crucial 2-week period of his life. You could argue, and many have argued, that he is Kentucky's president. He's born in Kentucky, as you all know, and his earliest memories were in Kentucky, and he was profoundly shaped by Kentucky. He married a Kentuckian. His best friend for a long time, Joshua Speed, was a Kentuckian. All of his law partners were Kentuckians, and the entire state of Kentucky was crucial to his strategy for holding together the Union in 1861 as he came into power. So Lincoln really never stopped being a Kentuckian, and I'd love to talk about what Kentucky meant to him in Q&A tonight. He did not take the train through Kentucky. He came very near to Kentucky. The train went along the northern edge of the Ohio River for long stretches, and he looked out into Kentucky and talked about Kentucky, but did not go into it. And that reflected the very unusual political reality of February 1861, where Lincoln was trying to act as if he was the president of the entire United States, but really was only the president-elect, not the president of half of the United States, and trying to keep the crucial border states, including Kentucky, in the Union at least as long as it took him to get to Washington, a city that was as close to the South, arguably closer to the South than it was to the North, and in considerable danger of falling into the hands of Southern militias who were talking a lot about taking Washington and making it the capital of their new country. And so Lincoln, as he's coming into be the president of the United States, and we know our history books, we know that he made it, he's facing a kind of existential uncertainty about whether he will actually arrive at the capital of the United States and whether it will be pro-American in the sense of the word, meaning pro-United States government, or if local elements marching with guns in the streets in a way that we've seen a lot of in 2020, we're going to take it over for a very different cause, for a pro-Confederate cause, although the Confederacy is coming into existence at the exact same moment that Lincoln is on this train. So my book is all about a train ride, and I'm so happy that that's true. I feel so grateful to this book for a lot of reasons. Sometimes, we feel that we choose topics, but sometimes the topics choose us. And with this book, I felt the power of a journey calling to me, and I felt the power of a story. And that's a word that historians are a little uncomfortable with. Stories in the center of the word history, in the original etymology of the word, but we tend to be distrustful of stories and top-down narratives and sentimentality and heroes, especially in the somewhat iconoclastic year of 2020, when we're not sure whom to look up to. It's a confusing time in history and in current events. And I did about the most old-fashioned thing you can do. I found an extremely famous president, Abraham Lincoln, about whom 15,000 books have been written. And I decided to add on to that pile with a book that is somewhat sentimental. It has a hero. Lincoln is the hero who survives adversity and makes it to Washington and saves America. And yet that story felt tremendously powerful and real to me as I did more and more of the research. I was lucky for a lot of reasons, but one is that I began the project in a kind of a journalistic way. I've been a bit of an unusual historian. I've written a fair amount for newspapers and not quite as much for academic journals, which is not how I was trained to write. It's just what happened. A lot of life is dealing with just what happens. And in 2010, I became involved with the beginning of a project in the online New York Times to write about the Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War. In 2010, it was the 150th anniversary of 1860. And then take it for a while, and we weren't sure how far it would go. We thought it would be a 6-month writing project. Some other young historians and I, we ended up covering the entirety of the Civil War and going all the way to 2015, always thinking about what happened 150 years earlier. And at the beginning of that project, I was trying to follow Lincoln, who was a very attractive protagonist to follow. I had loved him as a child reader of history, of old, really much older history books than were current in the time I was actually growing up. I read picture books from the 1930s and 40s about Lincoln that were in my grandparents' houses and in my school library, and felt an emotional attachment to Lincoln, even as a young reader at the very beginning of reading. And I just felt like following Lincoln in 2010 and 2011 as he changed from being the very unlikely president-elect into the actual president of the United States would be a good story, and it really was. And I want to say at the outset of this talk how weak Lincoln was, even after winning the presidency on November 6th, 1860. He won, it's kind of a remarkable fact, but our most famous president, revered by Democrats and Republicans alike, won with the second smallest percentage of the popular vote in our history, after only John Quincy Adams, who was running in a four-person race in 1824. Lincoln was also running in a four-person race, and he won enough electoral college votes to win securely, but he was well short of a majority. In fact, he was short of 40%. That's how small a percentage he got. And he won as the first Republican, but the Republican Party didn't really exist in a modern sense. It was a lot of state party organizations who didn't feel the same way on every issue. Some were more anti-slavery, some were less anti-slavery, some were annoyed by anti-slavery, and Lincoln was trying to manage the newness of his party and the diversity of his party, which had followed the collapse of the Whig Party and the split of the Democratic Party into northern and southern versions, and even some know-nothings of the mid-1850s who'd come into the Republican Party. He's trying to create a new party. At the same time, he's trying to become president of the United States, at the same time that he's a minority victor of the election, at the same time that Southerners are beginning to secede rapidly. And at the same time, many Southerners are talking about preventing Lincoln from ever becoming the president. They felt that there was a phrase one Southern newspaper used, numerical tyranny, that the North, by providing more votes than the South, had somehow cheated, that the South felt that it just had to win. And the North, by showing so many people voting for Lincoln, had supplied a kind of numerical tyranny, which of course it wasn't. That's democracy. But democracy was a very inexact science in 1860 and 61, as it remains in 2020. And Lincoln had to figure out how to get to Washington and become a legitimate president of the United States. And that was a much harder challenge than I ever realized. So going back to the beginning of this book, in January and February of 2011, I began to realize I had a great story I could follow with blogs in the New York Times for 13 days in a row describing Lincoln's train trip. And I thought this is a topic that lends itself naturally to a blog-like essay, because every day you can be in a new city and show photographs from that city and talk about the forward movement of the train, and it will engage readers. And that's not always how historians think. Historians think of how deep into the research can I dive, and how will my colleagues think about it? But I was thinking more like a contributor to the New York Times. How can I engage readership? And I'm glad I thought that way, because I ended up with a fantastic topic. And I wrote the 13 essays over 13 days, and I probably had half the book written after those 13 days. And then it took 9 years to write the other half. And I'm a little embarrassed and a little amused by that problem, but it involved heavy research. I just went all over the country and did deep dives into how every city, every small town was thinking about Lincoln as this incredibly transformative human being came through each small town. What did he look like to small town journalists? How did they describe him? Did they describe him as ugly, which many of them did, or surprisingly handsome, which some of them did, because there was so much anti-Lincoln invective? And what did he say in each small town? Did he tell a joke? Did he talk about American history? Did he give any hint of his plans to come as an incoming president? And I found a huge amount of information in studying local newspapers. So in the 13 days of my first foray into the topic, I got far, and I came away from it. It was exhaustive. I remember gearing up every day to write a serious thing and wondering if I could, and then finding all these great things and feeling satisfied at the end of the day. And over the time of writing those first blog essays in 2011, I began to feel the power of the story becoming apparent to me. And why it felt so powerful is worth maybe pausing to expand upon a little bit. But part of it is that America was so interesting, and I knew I loved geography and different regions, and I always have. And that was something no undergraduate history course or graduate ever taught me. And yet one of the most amazing things about our amazing country is the land and the water and how people came down rivers and crossed mountains and settled near lakes and figured out new businesses that derived power from rivers or lakes, or gave trading opportunities. And I'd been a fan for a long time, as I want to mention a close friend who lives among you, who's on this call, Emily Bingham. I'd been collecting 1930s WPA guidebooks for a long time in secondhand bookstores and reading about them with pure joy, about the diversity of America's geography. And I thought if I could convey some of the terrain that Lincoln is going through on this train, that would be a meaningful contribution, because a lot of history books just sort of talk about America or the United States as if it's a single place, and it's hundreds and thousands of places. And just in his 13-day trip across about 2,000 miles, Lincoln goes through every kind of place you could imagine. Farm communities where they come up to the train track to watch him go by. Small towns where the train would slow for a minute or two, maybe not even stopping, but slowing down enough for him to wave and speak a word or two to the people gathered around. And people gathered in very large numbers. Bigger towns where there would be a reception that might last 5 minutes, and then big cities like Cincinnati and Buffalo and New York City, the biggest of them all, where absolutely enormous crowds came out to greet Lincoln. 100,000, 150, 200,000, enormous crowds watching this fascinating figure come through the land to become the leader of a country whose very identity was in crisis. So the diversity of the landscape was a powerful incentive to me to write this book. And I want to come back to the Ohio River. And if I forget, I hope someone will remind me in Q&A, because the Ohio River, I would give it the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor in my story. It's really important to the young Abraham Lincoln and to the story of this train trip, because his train flirts with the river for a long, long way. It comes to Cincinnati and even before Cincinnati in southern Indiana. And then it comes back around Steubenville, Ohio, and winds around a curve in the Ohio into Pittsburgh. But Lincoln thought a lot about the Ohio River, and it shaped him profoundly. And I want to come back to how important that river is. But the topic also appealed to me because Lincoln, who we think of as this great kind of finished product, wasn't finished at all. He was very much in formation in February 1861. He was changing from a small town politician in a small town in central Illinois, also on a river, to something grander on the national stage and the world stage. And you see across the 13 days of this journey, someone growing very quickly, growing because of his internal work. He's reading a lot and thinking a lot about the crisis, and he's reading American history. And among other great qualities of Abraham Lincoln is he was a great historian of the United States. And I argue in the book that when he was at a disadvantage, which he most certainly was at the beginning of this trip, disliked by the existing government of the United States, the feeble James Buchanan administration, which was still the actual government of the United States, hated by Jefferson Davis and the beginnings of the Confederate government. Lincoln outmaneuvered all of them by reading American history better. He kept talking about the core principles, the ethical principles that make this country special. It sounds so hokey to use words like that, but that is the core of my book, is that Lincoln understood what made this country special. And he began to talk more and more beautifully about it over the 13 days. And in the last 2 days, as he was getting a great deal of information about a plot to kill him, a very advanced plot to kill him in Baltimore as he came through on the last few hours on the way to Washington, he's writing some of the most beautiful words he ever wrote about the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and its thundering chorus of equality. That's a phrase from Herman Melville. But what the Declaration promises, even though written by a slaveholder working within a committee that included non-slaveholders, but nevertheless written by a slaveholder, what it holds forth for all people in the United States and all people on earth is a better chance, a chance for these powerful human rights of equality, life, liberty, and happiness, and all of the rights that ensue from those rights. And Lincoln kept reminding Americans in the turmoil of 1860 and 61 that those rights were paramount, that states' rights, while important, were not as important as the philosophical principles of the Enlightenment that undergirded the entire experiment of American democracy, that it was an ethical experiment. It was not just a laboratory experiment in a new political structure. It was a test for people to treat each other better. And he said that beautifully, and he said it within the very small space that was available to him of not being too abolitionist, which would cost him crucial support in Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Virginia, which stays in the Union past his inauguration, which was very, very important, but also in every state where abolitionism was very far from a fait accompli. So Lincoln is in development, and the more I thought about this journey of a hero toward a destination, the more it resembled the great epics of all time, Homer's Odyssey, which I quote from at the beginning of every chapter, and Don Quixote. Lincoln looks a little bit like Don Quixote, a kind of skinny guy on a sagging horse. He looked like that earlier in his career in the legal circuit, and people laughed at the way he looked on a horse. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which is a book Lincoln loved. He also loved Don Quixote and Homer's Odyssey and Robinson Crusoe. And it more and more seemed to me like a powerful story of putting America back together again. And I had no inkling when I started it in 2011 that it would be published in 2020, which was another moment when so many of us were worried about putting America back again. And in fact, I really wish it had come out 3 or 4 years earlier. That was every bit my intention. But I just dropped so deep into the research. It took a long time. And I want to acknowledge my beautiful late editor, Alice Mayhew, who yelled at me a lot to get me to get rid of all my excess research. And I hated to do it, and I'm so glad she made me do it. But I do feel that the book has some value in 2020 for helping us to come back together across our bitter partisan lines and all the other lines that divide us. And I'm grateful to talk to a Louisville audience because Louisville has been so important in the national conversation in 2020. And it also was in 1860. You know, Kentucky has always been right there at the center of what it means to be American. And I don't have to tell you, Lincoln grew up worshiping Henry Clay. He wrote a really interesting eulogy of Henry Clay in 1852. And he read Louisville newspapers. They were his chief source of information as a semi-literate young man growing up in southern Indiana after the family moved across the Ohio River in 1816. Louisville was really important to Lincoln. And I've even found some stories, which maybe if we have time later, I can share, but of some relatively unknown Lincoln stories in Louisville that are absolutely fascinating, that involve arguments over slavery when he was a young man, and Lincoln as basically a young working class kid, a laborer coming into Louisville to make a little bit of money before going back across the river into southern Indiana to bring money to his family. But he was up close facing the inequities of slavery. And I forgot to mention another epic journey in literature, which is Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And one part of this research that fascinated me was looking at the young Lincoln on the Ohio and what the Ohio meant to him, which was both danger and opportunity. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a kind of small-time businessman who had bad luck, and a couple times he would organize a boatload of goods that he would try to take down the river to sell the way so many people did in the 18 teens and 20s, and a bad wave would come along and overturn his boat, and his entire worldly wealth would be lost. And Lincoln looked at that, I think, with incredulity and contempt. How could anyone be so foolish as to lose everything because a wave came along? And so Lincoln became, as a teenager, and then as an older young man, a very savvy operator of boats on the Ohio River, working from southern Indiana mainly, but reaching out into the river to meet the interesting stream of human traffic coming up and down the Ohio. I talk a little bit in the book about how extremely interesting people were coming up and down the Ohio, including Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s and Lafayette in the 1820s. Lincoln was near to them. And as he got bolder as a flatboat pilot, he went on longer and longer journeys, including 2 to New Orleans, down the Ohio and then down the Mississippi, that profoundly shaped his thinking about slavery. And there's a great book, I have it right here, not that well known, Lincoln in New Orleans, by Richard Campanella, that describes Lincoln on the rivers, the Ohio and the Mississippi, and what happened to him, including the beginnings of his deep revulsion against a slavery system that was obviously so cruel, and the things he saw in New Orleans in particular that made him hate slavery. But the Ohio, even more than the Mississippi, I think was really important to him and to America. The Mississippi is famous, obviously, for Huck Finn and other reasons, but the Ohio River is a longer and more interesting border between slavery and freedom than the Mason-Dixon line. We talk a lot about the Mason-Dixon line in the history books. That's just the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. I mean, it's important. It's also Delaware and Maryland, but the winding Ohio River from Pittsburgh all the way down to Cairo, Illinois, is a fascinating living border with the water shifting around, the land shifting around, and people's feelings shifting around. And Lincoln's life was inside that river for a long time. In fact, his teenage work as a flatboat pilot usually involved going halfway across the river, not all the way across, because he was so conscious of the border between freedom and slavery and borders between two different states. So I talk a lot in the book about what the Ohio meant to Lincoln. I talk about his invention of he's the only president to this day with a patent. He invented a device to help flat boats get over shoals. And that's all about being on the Ohio River. If the river suddenly gets very shallow or there are rocks, Lincoln invented a kind of inflatable device that would help a boat get over the river, which is not so different from what he was trying to do as a politician to help America get over the crisis of 1861. In constant ways, I was thinking about the Ohio River throughout the writing of this book. And I talked about how different it is in a place like Cincinnati and in Steubenville, Ohio, where you're looking across a very different Ohio River at northern Virginia, what is now West Virginia. And as Lincoln came around that bend into Pittsburgh and then back into northern cities, into Cleveland and Buffalo and Albany and New York and Philadelphia, Harrisburg, back into Philadelphia and then down into Washington, I talked about how much seeing America in all these spots had helped him to grow as a thinker and as a president who could represent everyone in this country. Just before he came into Cincinnati, his train pulled into Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and he gave a beautiful speech looking across the Ohio at Kentucky. And probably there were Kentuckians in his audience on the Indiana side. And he was, of course, extraordinarily politically aware. And he knew that his remarks would be picked up by the press who were hanging on his every remark. But I think he also knew that real Kentuckians were in the audience on the shore in Indiana. And he said, I'm speaking to you as a Kentuckian, and I want you to know we think of you as every bit as good as us. And throughout that train ride, he thought about the totality of America, that people with very different opinions from very different parts of the country were still a part of this tremendously exciting national project. And by staying close to that way of thinking and uniting people rather than dividing them, he came up with a beautiful message that he articulated especially well in the final 2 days of the trip. And by the time he got into Philadelphia's Independence Hall, I think he had figured out his message for the rest of his presidency. He gave a speech there that was very similar to the Gettysburg Address about how the Declaration gives us the truths we need to cohere as a society. And the story of that intellectual journey and geographical journey and personal journey of someone who was learning a lot as he went across America in these 2 weeks is what kept me thinking about America and hoping for America so fervently over the last 9 years. And I feel all those thoughts. I feel optimism. I feel concern the way people did in 1861. And we've got a pretty big night. I'm grateful to all of you for listening to me when we've got a big presidential debate to get to later tonight. But there are beautiful truths inside our country's history. They were articulated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They were strengthened by Abraham Lincoln during this train ride and again at Gettysburg and in his 2 inaugural addresses. And all that writing is there for a reason. It's to help guide us to where we need to be as fellow Americans in 2020.
Goodness gracious. There are a couple of things I want to say, and then we'll get started with the Q&A. First, to Emily Bingham. You helped us bring Ted to Louisville. Thank you. Secondly, Ted, your deep, deep, deep patriotism shines through. Thank you,
Dick.
Well, now let's get to the questions. The first one I'm going to enunciate is from Emily Bingham. My dear friend, please tell those Louisville stories, and please tell us what you learned and how about the response of Black Americans along his journey to Washington.
Well, that's such a good question, and I'm not surprised coming from Emily, who's a great historian in her own right. There are amazing stories about Lincoln in Louisville. They exist in the somewhat shadowy world of anecdotes that were told about him by people who lived among him growing up in his, not always that literate communities in Southern Indiana, family members, cousins who just told things about him. But there's one story, which is in this book, which I held up, Lincoln in New Orleans, by Richard Campanella, that Lincoln worked on, he dug a canal in Louisville for a couple months in the 1820s, just a young man needing some money. So he was a common laborer digging a canal with his cousin, Dennis Hanks. There's an amazing story that I think is really important, and I'll pause a little before saying it, but it's in another book about Lincoln's childhood, and amazingly, it's not in the big Lincoln biographies, and there are a few in the last 10 years. There are hundreds over the last 150 years, but in another summer, Lincoln was working in Louisville, and he was working in a mixed racial environment. There were slaves in the work. He was a manual laborer as a young man. And a pitcher, a kind of ceramic pitcher, got knocked off a wall and broke. A young white man broke it. And the owner of the factory came in and was furious and had a whip, and he started whipping the slaves who were working in the same workplace. And Lincoln objected and said he didn't do it. It wasn't him. And the guy actually whipped Lincoln twice. And Lincoln stopped the whip and beat him up. And you couldn't do that. Couldn't do that in that social world. This is just one story, and it comes through a fair amount of hearsay. So, it's not exactly written down. It comes through anecdotes about Lincoln after he died, told by family members and people who knew him around Southern Indiana. But Lincoln's friends in the workplace, they knew he'd done a good thing. They said, you have to get out of here immediately. And he raced to get on a boat across the Ohio, across from Louisville, got across and went into the woods and hid while patrols came out looking for him. And he was basically living like a slave. And he got through that scrape, but it's a pretty amazing story about the man who later ended slavery, that he knew what it was like to be running from a patrol with dogs out looking to catch you.
The importance of the Ohio River you mentioned, and you said that you would like to elaborate on. There is a letter from Lincoln to a member of the Speed family with his experience of slavery being rather horrifying to him when he saw slaves with clevises around their wrists, like fish on a line. Can you talk
Yeah.
to us about that and the importance of the Ohio River to him?
Yeah, there is a line like that he said, Dick. You're absolutely right. It's a powerful kind of literary image of like fish on a line. Exactly.
On a trot line, I think.
That's right. That's right.
And I've forgotten if he sent it to Joshua Speed or to a Speed wife or sister.
Right. Well, and this set of Kentucky friendships is so interesting because he's very close to them. I mean, he marries a Kentuckian. I forgot to say that. And all of his major female relationships, as awkward as they all were with Kentuckians. And his legal partners were Kentuckians, and Speed, his best friend, is Kentuckian. And he's a Kentuckian. He is a Kentuckian. So he's trying to figure that out, sometimes talking with people who aren't as enlightened as he is. But he, partly because he's so poor, he goes on these long boat trips, and the nature of the flow of the water, as you all know, you get on a raft, it's going to take you down to the Mississippi River, and then it's going to take you to New Orleans. And so he went down there. He went into deeper and deeper slavery, and he went on 2 long trips there. And in New Orleans, he apparently saw terrible things. He saw basically naked women standing on podiums with purchasers walking around, kind of pinching their flesh and talking about them in vulgar ways about whether they were worth the price to buy. And he was a moralistic guy. He'd also lost his mother, among other things. And something in him changed, and he resolved, in his own words, that if he ever had a chance, he would hit it hard. He would hit slavery hard, which he did. And I'm in the school of thinking that Lincoln really did a great deal to end slavery. And that even that is a complicated topic among historians. And if any of you read the 1619 Project last year, it was wonderful for its passion and the quality of its writing, and for putting the Black experience in American history front and center, and all that was great. But in my opinion, it was shabby in its treatment of Abraham Lincoln, who deserved better. And all that happened to Lincoln in it was he has a brief cameo as a racist president who's only thinking about colonization and how to get African Americans somewhere else. And that isn't who he was. He was thinking profoundly about this injustice his entire life. And when he soft pedaled it, which he did at times, it was usually for a shrewd political reason, as the shrewdest political actor in our history figured out how to get through a tiny path to get abolition, how to end slavery in a country that didn't really want to end it either in the North or in the South. It wasn't an anti-slavery country. And Lincoln accomplished a miracle by ending slavery. And I think he deserves more credit for that than he receives. But I understand the pain coming from the African American experience. I just hope with the fullness of time, we can all look at it in a colorblind way and see that this brave American, he experienced it up close as a kid. Actually, on the way back on one of those Mississippi River journeys, he got beat up by slaves, escaped slaves near Baton Rouge. He got in a fight on his raft and had a cut over his eyelid for the rest of his life. But he understood a core moral truth, which is that you cannot have slavery in a country that is based on the Declaration of Independence. And he helped us get over that the same way his flotation device helped a small boat get over a rock.
What was it in his inner being that enabled him or encouraged him or sustained him to do that?
Well, what came to me over and over again, I wanted to write this book in a more cynical way. Cynicism sells books. It's like a lot of social media is snarky, and you're not supposed to be too sentimental or patriotic in a serious academic book. And yet the power of his ethics kept coming back to me. He treated his family very well. He treated his neighbors very well. And I have an early chapter talks about his incredible farewell address to the town of Springfield and how that kind of established the template for the whole trip to come. And he didn't want to crush the South. He just wanted America to be a single country that worked along the principles laid out by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. That he understood not all people would have the same amount of wealth or education, and that some people wouldn't want to associate with people who looked very differently from them physically. But what he believed absolutely was that everyone had the chance to make the best of life according to their talent and their willingness to work and their love of their children. And slavery violated all of that. So he was, in his quiet way, he was not a loud abolitionist. He was a quiet, ethical thinker, but he understood that this could not be a great country on the world stage, which it was already starting to be, if it didn't resolve these internal contradictions. And I think if he were alive today, he would not only be an articulate voice on racial injustice, but he would be thinking a lot about economic injustice, about poor white people who are very much a part of the Trump coalition. But he would want everyone to have a chance to lead a dignified life, and he'd be all for the best possible public education and for generous treatment of the elderly, which he talks about in the second inaugural, government aid for widows and veterans. He appreciated people who we might think of as in the right wing today, but he wanted us very much to be a single country looking out for each other, and immigrants always coming in and renewing the American idea, starting new businesses and bringing their special talents.
Are there other American presidents who come to mind who, in their journeys to Washington, confronted similar psychological and character building moments?
Well, that's a good question. I talk in an early chapter about a kind of existential dilemma of the United States in the early 19th century, which was that we just sort of unthinkingly expected the country to keep expanding west, which it did, manifest destiny. But then we also thought presidents would start coming in from the western regions, which they did. But it was really hard to travel across very significant distances. And Zachary Taylor had a lot of trouble coming in. He's familiar to you all. And before him, William Henry Harrison, who's from not very far away from Louisville, North Bend, Ohio, right on the Ohio. I think his journey killed him. Before it's often mentioned that he caught a cold in a snowstorm in his inaugural address. I think the difficulty of his journey was wearing him down significantly before he even got to Washington. And I argue a little bit tongue in cheek, but seriously also, that Washington, D.C. was and is a terrible location for a capital of a country as great as the United States of America. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in a sleepy bend of a river 160 miles from the big water. You can't get big ships up there, so you cannot have normal mercantile trade of the kind cities expect. It wasn't connected in an informational way with other places, and it's surrounded by slave plantations. So it was not a great place for a capital of a democratic republic.
This ties in. In our culture of social media and instant communication, it's difficult to imagine how people came to know Lincoln and who he was. How did the average American hear of or learn about Lincoln in this time?
Great question. And let me say, I want to give out my email address if people don't get a question in while we're talking. It's just my name with an underscore in the middle, Ted_Widmer, WIDMER @brown.edu. I don't teach at Brown anymore, but I just kept the email. So if you don't get to ask your question, I'm happy to answer it by email. Well, Lincoln was a very savvy communicator. He was an interesting mixture of this small town guy, homespun virtues, but he was good on the telegraph. And the telegraph goes along the railroad. I talk a lot about how the railroad and telegraph were changing America a lot in the years just before his election. And he had a sense that every word he spoke along the journey would get picked up. There are reporters writing in shorthand so they can get every word and rushing to the train station telegraph office to get it out to the entire country, including the South. Even places that had seceded were listening because it was all in limbo. Secession might have been a threat to get a better deal to then come back in. No one quite knew if it was a business strategy and a negotiation or if it was the real thing and they were starting a new country. And so everyone is hanging on every word. And he gave some clunker speeches. He gave pretty bad speech in Indiana where he actually, I just said how ethical he was, and he was, but he sort of briefly drifted into a mildly sexual joke about how the South thought of union not as a marriage, but as a kind of free love association where you could just sort of come in when you wanted to and then leave when you wanted to and not be married. And that was actually a very shocking and pretty sexual comment in 1861, and he got attacked for that. And he gave some clunker speeches. He wasn't ever a very good speaker on the economy, although that was an important topic in 1861. There was a depression among every other problem, and he gave a bad speech on the economy in Pittsburgh. But on the subject of what draws Americans together and what we believe in together and how we should treat each other, he was unparalleled and still is.
Here are three good questions that are pointed. Recently, I was doing research for a presentation concerning North Carolina. I came across a place named Bostic, North Carolina. There's a site marker stating Lincoln was actually born in North Carolina and shortly thereafter moved to Kentucky. Have you ever come across the contention of Lincoln being born in North Carolina?
Really interesting question. I've never heard it. Pretty sure it's not true because we know from all the cousins and the family members that he was born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, and lived there till he was 7. That's a long way to go from North Carolina to Kentucky. So I don't think that's true. There are other questions that are fascinating, like who are Lincoln's grandparents? And his mother, Nancy Hanks, was illegitimate, and there is speculation her father was a distinguished Virginian, or maybe from one of the Carolinas, but I'm pretty sure he was born in Kentucky.
Here's another one. Did Lincoln have any involvement in helping establish the Republic of Liberia? It was meant to be a better place for African Americans to live in West Africa. I think that what that goes to is the American colonization movement and the Kentucky Society of Colonization as well.
He did support that for most of his political career, and he loved Henry Clay. who also supported colonization. And that has a slightly negative association today, but it was trying to be altruistic. It was certainly much better than the many Americans who were just pro-slavery. It was saying maybe we can help these fellow Americans relaunch their lives somewhere else where they won't have to suffer from the stigma of racial prejudice. And Lincoln went along with that for a long way, but it's pretty clear by the second half of his presidency, he's on a course toward emancipation there's a cabinet meeting July 22nd, 1862, when he announces his intent to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And at that point, that is the program.
And then here's one from Mike V. How was the route planned? Why so far south?
Great question. Well, that was really fun for me to think about because he had a direct route he could have gone on that would have been much shorter. Could have gone through some of Kentucky and what is now West Virginia and Virginia. But he felt that his presence in those states would have been inflammatory. He'd done extremely badly in the election of 1860. He got, in all of Louisville, he got 100 votes. Louisville's a big city. He's a Kentuckian, and he does horribly. I think he got like 1 or 2% of the vote in Kentucky in 1860. So he understands he's got to give it a rest. And keeping Kentucky and Virginia in is crucial. There's a famous quote attributed to Lincoln: "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Yeah. And so if he had to do an end run around Kentucky, he was happy to do it. And the trains kind of work that way anyway. One of the things I point out in the book is that the train structure of the United States wasn't that good for North-South relationships. So just like politics weren't that good, the train also was not very good at crossing the Ohio River. And in fact, did not. Cincinnati was trying to get there and had these two twin towers, but no bridgeway underneath them. You couldn't cross. You could cross on a roadway at Wheeling, but you couldn't take a train across that. So you could not actually get across the Ohio River on a train, which was fascinating to me. I just assumed that you could. And later the L&N is such a great railroad, and Louisville's a great railroad town, among other things. But that was another way America was kind of broken. You couldn't get from north to south that easily. So he goes along the Ohio River for all of these stretches. And he chose state capitals on purpose because he liked meeting with governors and legislatures. It kind of built up his legitimacy. And if he was going to have to call up troops, which he did have to, it would help him to have gone to each state legislature in person to kind of establish a relationship. So,
an interesting question, and we're going to go a little bit over because I want to make sure that everyone's questions get answered. States' rights versus Enlightenment values. Could you elaborate what you meant by that?
Sure. Well, Enlightenment values, that refers to a broad body of thinking in the later 18th century, from about 1760 to 1790, but including the American Revolution, that just believed there was a great inherent worth in human beings, that poor people were potentially as important in a society if they got some education. And you think of someone like Ben Franklin, who grew up poor, but became an incredibly prolific writer and scientist. And Franklin was a kind of hero of the Enlightenment, but it was an international movement. The French, a lot of Enlightenment thinking came out of France, and to some extent England and Germany and Italy and Spain. And the American Revolution was an interesting test case. Democracy was not just about America, but a broader philosophical way of thinking that people are smart and decent and can organize their own societies. We don't need kings and aristocrats to tell us what to do. So, and Jefferson is absolutely an Enlightenment thinker, and so is John Adams, so is George Washington. States' rights evolve quickly around the same time, and the Kentucky Resolution of I think it's 1800 is a very important early marker of states' rights, and it was a kind of way. I mean, it was a principle within democratic thinking that we don't want to just be supine before federal governments. We have our local interests, our economic interests, and our character. But it pretty quickly turned into a smoke screen for the protection of slavery. And in 1832 in South Carolina, nullification crisis, it seems on the surface like it's about a tariff, but it also feels a lot like it's about getting ready for a crisis that will come in the future over whether slavery is going to be permitted to continue across North America or even fill up all of the states of the United States, which is what the slave power was trying to do at the end of the 1850s, or if states could continue to claim their laws protected slavery. So if you believed in the inherent worth of every individual, as the Enlightenment did, and I'm not trying to say it was colorblind, because it wasn't. These were all white men for the most part. But still, the philosophical principle held true that if you believe in the inherent worth of every human being, male, female, any racial background, that is the best of Enlightenment thought. And it is inherent in our Declaration of Independence. And that's why the establishment of the United States impressed so many people. It was not just founded on a political principle, it was founded on a moral principle, that all people have a worth inside of them. And states' rights, interestingly, can be held against an immoral federal government, and it was beginning to be in the late 1850s. Ohio, for example, often cited its states' right to protect freed slaves who had escaped to Ohio when federal marshals were coming to hunt them down in southern Ohio and bring them back to Kentucky. Ohio often cited a states' right against the US government when James Buchanan was president to protect African Americans. But for the most part, our federal government has usually kept us to the higher principles, as it did in the civil rights movement. And states' rights have largely protected more local interests, which tended to be more about economics and in our earlier history about slavery.
Ted, thank you so much. We've had a wonderful Q&A following a wonderful lecture. I think almost all of the questions have been asked and answered, but again, on behalf of the Filson Historical Society, thank you for a very, very, very enriching evening.
Thank you, Dick, and I'd love to come out in person if circumstances permit in the next year or two.
The hopeful side of my nature tells me that will happen. And we're looking forward to hosting you when it does. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, Dick.
Good night, everybody.